humanities angle that we started with. But we knew we were leading up to this more empirical work. So we're working with Emily Holmes and also Katerina Vanucci, who you'll meet at the here amongst the group also. Katerina, I'm talking about you to Diana.
Oh, hello.
Hello there. I'm just clicking through. Hi, Jacopo, and everyone else who I haven't met. Oh, there you are, Katerina. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Great.
So we should mention that we're already recording, right?
Yeah, I think everyone gets an alert when they but we are 2 minutes past the hour, so we should get going. So welcome everybody. We're very excited today because Diana Omigie is joining us from Goldsmiths University. Diana has been with us on some of the previous seminars this time, which has been wonderful. And she is a cognitive neuroscientist based at Goldsmiths University, where she's a member, possibly director of the Music, Mind and Brain Research Group. And those of us with a philosophical bent will be pleased to note that there's a distinction between mind and brain observed in the title of this august institution. So we're very pleased about that. And she's done a great deal of research, and a lot of it is on music, about which she's going to be talking today. She's done some really fascinating work on the kind of exploratory techniques listeners use when dealing with atonal music, which is like standout piece for me, but also done a lot of work on our perception of beauty in music and its perceptual and cognitive benefits. So really exciting that you're joining us today, Diana. Please take the word. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Guy. And yes, it's a real pleasure to be here today. So thanks very much for the invitation. It was really nice to meet Elizabeth for the first time last year and to learn about this forum, and what you're discussing on a semi-regular basis. As a psychologist and neuroscientist, I, take a very empirical approach to the study of music and musical beauty. And just to apologize in advance, because that means I'll be showing lots of data today at the expense of maybe sharing my some of my, pet or favorite theories about, what musical beauty is and so on. But just to say that I will, however, start with the overarching question, which very simply put is looking at sort of the psychological aspects of musical beauty, and put another way, sort of what musical beauty is from the perspective of an embodied, information-seeking and self-regulating mind. And I think beauty is interesting for psychologists because it seems to be this universal capacity that we have. And it also seems to be central to the aesthetic response to music. So in this study by Istok, they had several participants provide as many adjectives as they could in 5 minutes that described for them the aesthetic response to music, and beautiful came up as the most commonly or frequently occurring adjective, as well as the most central concept of all the adjectives that were provided. And yet there's still very many open empirical questions about musical beauty, and I won't try to list them all, but what I'll do is spend the rest of the time that I have speaking, just briefly introducing 3 studies that I've been involved in that look at musical beauty. And in the first study, we were interested in beautiful passages in music, using these as a way of exploring how musical beauty might feel in the flux of experiencing music. And in the second study, we were interested in actually looking at music on the whole piece level and getting people's self-report of how what features of music seem to be able to make it beautiful, what the effective qualities of experience are, and what impact musical beauty can have on us. And we were interested in how this might vary as a function of the individual. And just to say, you can see her because your faces are there, but Yuko in this image, Yuko Arthurs is a research fellow that I've had the great pleasure of having in my research group the last few years, and she's led this and the last study I'll be presenting today, which is where we looked at the consistency of musical beauty judgments. In other words, how much we agree with ourselves about where the particular, at a later time point, about where the particularly beautiful moments in a piece of music are. And just to say, with the first study, our starting point was an idea which I appreciate not everyone shares or maybe believes, but an idea that music, the experience of beauty might be an emotion as well as a judgment. And we were also sort of semi-inspired. There's a nod to Adorno's a condemnation of beautiful passages. He didn't like that people have these moments where they're savoring them at the expense of potentially listening to the entire piece and appreciating its, the entire piece's form. Regardless, we know that people value, specific moments in music often, and that potentially it offers a sort of opportunity to examine what I've, obviously call the emotional anatomy of beauty. And starting off, there were a few possibilities we could see. It's possible that beautiful passages all have the same emotional profile with regard to sort of emotion variables in the circumflex model. They'd be low in tension, low in energy, so in other words, low in arousal, but fairly pleasant or quite pleasant. So sort of narrow sense of beauty being described here. But the alternative was that there'd be lots of different profiles that we'd be able to uncover with this study. And the question was, what would they be, and to what extent would we see that they were being reflected in people's physiological responses to the excerpts and reflected in what was actually going on in the music. So in this study, we had 33 participants come into the lab. Well, before they came into the lab, they had to fill out an online questionnaire in which they listed the pieces of music that for them contained beautiful passages. And we asked them to provide timestamps, rough timestamps of where the beautiful passages were for them. And this was so we could carefully curate their listening experience when they came into the lab. When they came into the lab, they were listening to these pieces with their eyes closed while we recorded a bunch of physiological variables. These are quite respiration, heart rate, skin conductance, all capture quite well arousal. Physiological arousal, and the facial muscles are quite good indices of valence, the extent to which an experience is more or less pleasant. And so we recorded all these physiological variables, and after they'd listened uninterrupted to all their pieces, we then had them listen again, but this time using the spacebar on a keyboard to indicate the beginning and the end of each beautiful passage. And so they would just press the spacebar button down for the duration of the beautiful passage. And when they released it, they would be presented with all these questions about the extent to which they experienced tension or energy or a sense of pleasantness while they were listening. I was particularly interested in empathy at the time, so I threw those in as sort of ways in which we might engage with this section of music. And we just asked about how much they actually really liked those moments and how beautiful they found those moments. So we got all that data, ratings data, so to speak. And by the end of the experiment, what we had was 420 beautiful passages. And just to say, participants had brought in pop music, classical music. In this particular study, you'll see there's a bit more pop and rock than classical music. I think it's something to do with the younger population, and it might have something to do with this idea of passages as opposed to whole pieces. But either way, the very first exploratory analysis just looked at how beauty was related to the other variables that we'd captured. And we see that there's a very strong association between beauty and liking, not that surprising, a sort of more moderate one between beauty and how much, those moments were able to, stimulate interest or feelings of empathy or valence. Much less strong was the relationship between beauty and energy and beauty and tension. And just to say, that would actually be a good preliminary indicator of the fact that beautiful passages may have slightly different emotional profiles. But to really show that, ideally we'd use a slightly different analyses, and that's what we did. We wanted to group beautiful passages according to their similarity to each other. And so we submitted these beautiful passages to what's called a clustering analysis, where the input variables are the emotion variables. And what we saw was sort of robust evidence for 3 types of beautiful passages that differed in terms of the amount of tension and energy they were inducing. And forgive the sort of ugly looking labels, but they're just, there were the ones that were low in tension and low in energy, the ones that were sort of were low in tension but high in energy, and the ones that were high in tension and high in energy. They all had similar levels of pleasantness, or induced similar levels of, or Wohlgefühl. It was nice to experience, so to speak. But they differed in these 2 arousal variables. And just to say that we tried this with a few different clustering methods and got very similar results. These beautiful passages didn't just differ in terms of these arousal variables, but also in terms of the degree of interest and liking that listeners attributed to them, ascribed to them. So the more high arousing beautiful passages were the ones that were also more interesting to listeners, and the moderate arousing beautiful passages were liked best. And this kind of resonated for us with sort of the literature we've been reading about the role of interest in musical beauty, and certainly the idea of it felt silly at the time asking about liking, but turns out actually what we were capturing there was a sort of moderate levels of arousal seemingly being the most liked or valued in some way or enjoyed. So with these beautiful passages, we had the self-report of them, but of course we could look at the music to see what was going on there. And just to say, this is far from a complete list of things we'd have liked to look at, but we wanted to use some music information retrieval methods that are, are quite, in the end, quite limited. They were quite limited at the time, but we looked at a few variables to see how they differentiated, musical variables or features, to see how different or not they were across the different types of beautiful passages. And just to list off a few things we saw that intuitively, we saw that the high arousing beautiful passages were also associated with sort of increase in loudness from just before the moments to the passages themselves. Moderate arousing, low tension, high energy beautiful passages had this tendency for the music to go from slightly more minor to slightly more major, or just within the major sort of key tonality, become more major, more clear and key. High tension, high arousal, the highest arousing beautiful passages were associated with this increase in pitch register. And lastly, lowest arousal beautiful passages, so low in tension, low in energy, were not associated with any significant changes. In other words, from the moments preceding to the moments themselves, there was no change in any of the variables we looked at. And however, we saw that these moments tended to be lower in tempo and lower in polyphony than all the other passages, explaining why they're experienced as low tension and low arousing to participants. But just to say, we saw sort of this evidence that, musical features discriminate the types of passages that we had seen people report differently. Finally, we looked at sort of how people were responding to these passages, and we saw, not surprisingly, that the most high arousing beautiful passages were associated with a very good index of arousal, increase in skin conductance, which is basically bits of sweat on your skin, on your palms or fingers. Low arousing beautiful passages, so the ones that didn't have any noticeable change that we'd observed, were associated with an increase in smiling, and also this increase in respiration rate from fairly low, which is in keeping with perhaps they were slightly sort of calmer pieces, but fairly low to suddenly having the sort of respiration rate arousal level of other passages. But yeah, lots of mini findings there. I think ultimately what we try to do with this study is show that, or we suggest that it provides evidence for multiple emotional profiles with respect to beautiful passages in music. In other words, beauty in the flux of listening to music is associated with different levels of tension and energy, and certainly variations in how much we're interested in the music at that moment, or are enjoying it or like it. I guess it sort of suggests that when we're thinking about musical beauty, it's not just this one thing. It's certainly in the context of the experience, there might be different sort of flavors to it, and these, necessarily driven by what's happening in the music. So much for musical beauty on the level of beautiful passages. In the next study, we wanted to look on the level of the piece, the whole piece. And our research questions were as follows. We were interested in what musical features listeners themselves think make a piece of music beautiful. We wanted to know what they feel when they find a piece of music beautiful versus when they're listening to a piece of music they don't find beautiful, and what, if any, impact experiencing musical beauty had for them. And we were interested in the extent to which these things varied as a function of the listener in terms of their expertise, and also psychologists love the personality inventories, and so we threw that in because there were one or two we were particularly interested in. And so in this study, we had 81 participants, and it was completely online. In the first part of the study, they had to tell us 3 pieces of music that they find to be beautiful. But also in the second part, or depended, it was counterbalanced, they would also have to say 3 pieces of music that they listen to often, but wouldn't describe as beautiful. And then we had them, for these groups of pieces, beautiful or not beautiful, give us some free text responses where they were saying what they thought made the pieces of music beautiful, either as a group or each piece in isolation. We asked them how they feel when they listen to those pieces of music, and if they've been impacted in any way by the piece. If not, no problem. Were there any other pieces? Fine. If not, and yes, of course, we had them do the same for pieces that they don't describe as beautiful. We then administered these questionnaires, and because these are free text responses, we had to sort of code the responses. And so that was done by the first 2 authors of the paper, and with me sort of providing input. Inter-rater reliability assessments allow us to see the extent to which a third or fourth or fifth person might reach the same conclusions in terms of what these text responses were saying. So that was high. And then we carried out the necessary analysis to look at what the role of individual factors might be. And just to say, participants spanned from non-musicians to professional musicians. I thought it might be relevant to just describe the sort of genres that people were providing, and we've just sort of grouped things roughly into classical, pop, and rock, and you see that lots of those kinds of pieces were brought in, classical pieces. When they were brought in, they were more likely to be described as beautiful versus not. Rock, conversely, for example, was more likely to be described as not beautiful, and beautiful maybe not as surprising, but just certainly showing that people have these tendencies to find certain styles more or less. I actually moved a whole bunch of flowers that had pollen, but I guess they're coming from that direction. But just to say, of course, genres were not as interesting to us as what people were saying about the music or its features. And basically, when we looked at the responses to this question, what we saw was that responses could be grouped, or comments could be grouped into 3 kinds. What we call intrinsic features, building blocks, ones that we called sort of references to more cognitive structural factors related to the music or features, and ones that we related to aesthetic, what we called aesthetic criteria. And just to say that people were being asked, what makes this piece of music beautiful? What makes this, why wouldn't you describe this piece of music as beautiful? And so we found the same kinds of codes appearing, but what you'd see is, for example, with reference to timbre, where a beautiful piece of music for them might have, the voice might be described as having a rich tone, but not beautiful. The voice would be raspy and rough. Or they would say the melodies were pleasing for beautiful music, where they were disjointed and not beautiful music. Similarly, they would say the harmonies were pretty with well-fitting dissonance for beautiful music, but notice how there was no harmony or melody to speak of in the non-beautiful music. Looking at the cognitive structural factors, as we call them, we saw that contrast seemed to play an important role. People would refer to the fact that, what made music beautiful was the contrast from how gentle the song was at the beginning to the large climax at the end, for example. Conversely, they would say, not beautiful music was too simple, didn't have any contrast, or let's see what they said here. There were too frequent changes leading to a sort of restlessness. Beautiful music was just the right amount of complex, whereas not beautiful music was either too simple or didn't provide enough space for breath, and so on and so forth. Repetition in beautiful music links the whole piece together, where it was annoying in not beautiful music, for example. These are just a few quotes. And last but not least, looking at the criteria, as we called them, we saw people almost suggest that music was beautiful because it reliably moved them, or it had a specific kind of message, and it had some level of originality, things that were lacking for non-beautiful music. And just to say that we have some, also comments around the performance qualities and the levels of specificity. And the reason we call these aesthetic criteria is because we have an author who has very similar sort of things that he's described as aesthetic criteria in research on and how we make judgments about musical emotions or aesthetics. Moving a bit more quickly, we won't read too many quotes now because that tends to eat up a lot of time, but just to say, when we look at the question, our analysis of what people responded when we asked them how they feel when they listen to beautiful pieces of music, we see that they feel good. They feel as good as when they, or shall I say, for not beautiful pieces of music and beautiful pieces of music, they feel good. If it was a non-beautiful piece of music that they listened to often, it made them feel good. That was probably why they were listening. But you saw that beautiful music tended to be more likely to instill a sense of calm, maybe some sadness, mixed emotions, nostalgia, certainly more likely to induce a feeling of being moved and transportation. And in terms of the impact they reported music having on them, there was a tendency for people to say sort of provided them with lots of support in difficult times, or they would go to it in those moments. A group of people commented on how it sort of inspired musical activities for them, and we'll see a bit more what those might look like. I think what's interesting is that not beautiful music, more than beautiful music, was used, was reported as having helped shape their musical identity and identity in general. So it's almost like beauty wasn't used in that way or hadn't had that impact. It was the not beautiful music that they listened to often that was, you know, acting as a sort of life soundtrack for them and so on. So yeah, I won't show these quotes because I think we'll run out of time, and I am going to try to not spend too much time speaking. But they were just quotes that sort of were the basis on which I've shared that summary of what people responded to to those questions. But just to say, in terms of what listeners bring to the experience, we saw that amateur musicians, more than non-musicians and professional musicians, and people who were high in openness to experience this personality trait that's very much always predicting anything related to arts engagement and so on, they predicted a tendency for people to use a whole wide range of features or reasons why a piece of music was beautiful. So people who were amateur musicians or people who were high in openness to experience were more likely to say something about the nature of the qualities of the voice and the melody and the harmony and so on, and also talk about the contrast and the level of repetition, and also talk about, the expressivity and the performance qualities. They would say more about what made pieces of music beautiful than actually professional musicians and people who were lower in openness to experience. And similarly, we found that amateur and professional musicians, more than non-musicians, were likely to report beauty having had a musical influence on them. And here I thought it's worth just showing some of those quotes. So talking about how this beautiful piano music made them want to improve their own skills, how it impacted their compositional style, and how it even inspired them to follow music as a career. So just to summarize quickly, beautiful music seems to be judged as beautiful or rationalized as beautiful based on wide-ranging factors, more or less wide-ranging depending on the person, and seems to promote specific affective states, and certainly is valued as, compared to other non-beautiful music, is valued for its ability to sort of offer what we've called sort of emotional support, and certainly it seems to be able to inspire musical love for music. Expertise was something that, just to say expertise, of course, the individual matters. So expertise and openness seem to be predicting not just how beauty in music is rationalized, but also where the impact of musical beauty can be found. And just to say, because Yuko has been particularly interested in expertise, it sort of found its way into this third and final study that I'm going to describe today, where we were interested in how consistent we are with ourselves with regard to, or how consistent our beauty judgments are. In other words, how much we agree with ourselves about our experience of musical beauty on a second list or third listen. And when we looked in the literature, we saw that it suggested that judgments of music remain generally consistent over repeated ratings. In the study from Yuslin, They had people rate originality, expressivity, even beauty, and being moved in relation to some songs, and showed that there was no difference between how people reported on the first time and the second time of listening. We see similar patterns where people provide similar evaluations of musical performances when listening to it several times, but all of these studies had something in common, which is they were evaluating consistency only on the level of the whole piece. So a sort of judgment made at the end, and we wondered whether we would see less or potentially different amounts of consistency when we look at the dynamic experiencing of music over time. So in the study, we had 89 adults complete, I guess like the previous one, personalized online musical experiments. They identified pieces of music that they find beautiful, told us a bit about themselves, and completed some musical expertise measures. So we've used this in the previous study. In the Olin scale, you identify yourself as non-musician, music-loving non-musician, amateur, serious amateur, semi-professional, professional. But we also use another scale or a tool called the Goldsmith's Musical Sophistication Index, which sort of prides itself on looking at musical sophistication in a more nuanced way. Everything from just how much you love and engage with music to how much you've trained, and even just your listening skills, perceptual ability. And what we had people do is, after they told us what their beautiful music was, prepared their personalized experiment so that when we approached them the next week, we could ask them to sort of continuously rate over time their experience of beauty listening to their pieces. And we had them do that each piece a couple of times in a given sitting. We had them for each piece also rate loudness because we wanted to compare beauty to something else. And then we had them do the same in the third phase of the experiment. Just we were trying to minimize how much they had to keep doing this onerous task in one sitting. And then we did the relevant analyses in order to be able to, first of all, see what levels of consistency we can see between people's judgments. And certainly it's not stated here, but what the role of musicianship is. In case people are interested, people tended to bring in classical pieces of music, pop rock, followed by pop rock and others. And then in terms of the consistency findings, we saw that beauty tended to be less consistent than judgments of loudness, which is what we expected we might find, but it's noteworthy that non-musicians or people who didn't, who self-identified as non-musicians weren't that much, well, there was no significant difference between the consistency of loudness and beauty judgments. It was musicians who were much less consistent for beauty judgments than loudness judgments. And in other words, we saw this interaction whereby musicianship expertise predicted how consistent you were with this low-level perceptual feature, but didn't predict how consistent you were when it came to judging beauty. We had these other ways of sort of looking at musical sophistication, though, when we looked at what effect or how well they predicted consistency, and saw that how much you engage with music, whether you seek it out, to keep track of what you're hearing, ask people about it, doesn't predict consistency. We saw that musical training, much like I showed in a second ago, does predict loudness, but not beauty judgments, consistency of beauty judgments. But finally, we saw that this self-report of perceptual ability, the extent to which you said, I can tell two recordings apart very easily, or I can tell when someone's singing slightly out of tune, those kinds of abilities predicted the extent to which you showed consistency in your beauty judgments. So just to let's summarize, then sort of raise some open questions. Why might there be relatively less consistency for beauty judgments in musical experts, bearing in mind that there wasn't a difference in non-musicians, hence the emphasis here. There's lots of reasons. I'd love to hear your ideas, but at least one reason is that there might be on different listens, so to speak, shifts in attention it's been suggested that whenever we attribute, whenever we sort of enhance the attention we place on specific moments, we might suddenly have a sort of stronger aesthetic response. Perhaps people are beginning to attribute beauty to those moments that they begin to attend more closely to. And I didn't show, but there's studies that show that on every listen, we shift our attention in terms of what we're listening out for. And then in terms of why perceptual ability might be better able to drive consistency, perhaps this ability to just detect these differences leads to us to recognize them, label them, and maybe then be able to apply explicit criteria that we reliably apply. And just to say, finally, those were 3 studies examining musical beauty in different ways. Studies 1 and 2, amongst other questions, asked what listeners think make music beautiful. I think I wanted to stress that I think it's clear that people are, talking about the structure of music, the aspects of the musical sound, and I would argue aspects of expectation. They're talking about contrasts and so on. But there's also this belief that music will move them, or there's quite a bit of emphasis on the role of sort of emotions. We see that expertise and the psychological trait openness brings something to, if not to the experience, but at least to how people rationalize their experience. And we see that, there might be, we're relatively less stable when we have musical ability, skills in sort of being consistent in our beauty judgments, and it could be lots of things going on that I haven't had the time to go into in this talk, but maybe we can discuss them. Finally, just to say that it's been fun to talk about beauty. It's not really something I see as the thing I work the most on. It was fun to do it in Germany when I was at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics, where that's exactly what you should be doing. Since coming back to Goldsmiths, it's been a range of different projects. But one thing I had been studying, which is not unrelated, is awe. And it came out of my work in musical expectancy. And it's actually led myself and Yuko, who I mentioned already, to start a study that's looking at sort of beauty and awe in music and to carrying out some cross-cultural comparisons. Just to say that I'm really excited to be talking about beauty with you, and maybe it'll enthuse me to do more work on it than I am already. But I think I'll stop there. I hope I haven't taken up too much time.
Not at all. It was perfectly timed. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Diana. I was put in mind one of the limitations of online seminar formats is that I couldn't rush and get you a glass of water, which
I know. I'm so sorry. That
well
looked really uncomfortable. It was, but it wore off eventually.
Wonderful, and it was interesting. You mentioned Adorno near the beginning, because you probably know one of his first job when he arrived in the States in 1938. He didn't have like a proper academic position when he arrived, and he was asked to kind of run experiments for the public radio station. I forget what it was called at the time. Kind of measuring people's responses to music in exactly these ways, and he got so fed up with it that he eventually just resigned.
Well, I feel that way sometimes.
Wrote a long essay, but that was Adorno for you. Terrific. That's super exciting. So we have questions lining up, and we'll begin with Elizabeth.
Thanks so much, Diana. I was really fascinated. I wish we could have spent much more time on each slide, but thank you. So I've got like a few thoughts, and I wonder, my question to you really is, how do they connect, or do they connect? So I think it was in study 2, you mentioned that one of the driving questions was this idea of what makes music beautiful, and you had this division of intrinsic features and cognitive structural factors, and then aesthetic criteria. And I started to think then that those, to me, at least the way they were described, were like 3 different understandings of beauty, or 3 different ways of identifying what beauty is. One more to do with kind of artistic beauty, the other which kind of reports or picks up on something to do with how it makes me feel, and the first more about the kind of complexity of that which is before me, to do with kind of composition and so on. So that's not a perfect description, but there was some sense in which one could say, but these are 3 different kinds of or senses in which something could be beautiful, right? And then there was, in the following study, this idea that when we looked at different musical genres, of course, the classical music scored really high, but then there were some surprises. I think it was like soul and funk came before jazz, things like that, which seemed to me a little, but that made me think again that maybe we're operating there, when you're asked those kind of questions, with a fairly kind of traditional kind of set idea of what beauty is, and it should sound a bit like, the light sonata or something like that. I mean, just like a little bit, we have these kind of paradigmatic examples, and jazz, this doesn't really fit into that picture. And then the final question you asked to do with why is there then less consistency among musical experts? But maybe that is because musical experts just have a more fine-grained sense of the different manifestations of beauty in music. And that there might be a sense in which, whether they would vocalize it in the way like a philosopher would or not, that they are more sensitive or alert to the fact that beauty can sound many different ways in music, depending on art or genre, and depending on whether you want to put the emphasis on how it makes you feel, or rather like how it, what it says to me about the aesthetic object that I'm engaging with in terms of structure and how it's kind of constituted in a way. So, yeah.
Yeah, interesting observation. So I think it was interesting actually for the first time to put these, to put the slides together and the 3 studies together. The first was conducted, or at least published, came out in 2017 or 18, I think. And the second only published last year, and the third was still working on it. So it was the first time, I was going to be putting them together, and it was interesting to see, the differences and similarities between them. So, and in terms of, for example, the musical stimuli, in all the studies, we asked people to bring in their own music. That's important. It ruled out exploring some things I think would be interesting, like learning effects. But certainly I didn't want people feeling that they needed to call things beautiful that they didn't. And I thought it was interesting that the younger sort of crowd in the first study didn't have, it wasn't all classical music. They brought in their pop and rock. And if I showed you a list, some of it is quite, it's very poppy. But I actually thought it was interesting because maybe because we asked for these passages, these moments, it was easier for them to just think of music they were listening to currently. And I think, and we didn't ask about what made those moments beautiful. We just know, the emotional qualities as they were experiencing them. I think with the second study where we ask people, I do think it's interesting how people respond, and the fact that it's the amateur musicians. So, some, decent skills, but they were the ones who were saying all these different ways in which music could be beautiful. It's almost like you wonder, I could go back and look at what the professional musicians were doing. Were they tending towards, I think we found actually that people who were high in openness to experience and the amateur musicians were applying these aesthetic criteria more than the others. And yeah, I guess, I don't know. I think what the findings, those 3 categories, intrinsic and cognitive structural, I think what they reveal is people are tending to the form. They are commenting on things very related to all the things that psychologists have brought up, and others have brought up, like the levels of complexity, this new interest in a sort of information content and novelty, and how it needs to be the right amount, repetition, not too much repetition, and so on. But also, more or less bringing up these ideas of how much, how original it needs to be. Originality didn't come up very much at all, but certainly it was interesting that, it needs to be, it was more the case that they would comment about musical pieces' originality than not. And I don't know, I guess, in the final study, I hadn't noticed jazz coming after soul or funk. I think that it was the first time I looked at the genres and saw what I might expect, these ideas of what might be more or less beautiful. But I thought it was interesting actually that the first study didn't show that, and it really shows that we saw that people bring in their own music, and that was not quite nice, because it's and this emphasis on what do people think makes music beautiful is, I guess, very Facknerian, and this bottom-up aesthetics. What do people think? And I like to see where it sort of really lines up with what philosophers have said or psychologists think. I don't know if there were any surprises really. Sometimes I feel like these findings are all very obvious, but yeah, I hope that tells you a little bit about how I interpret those findings. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Really interesting. John.
Yeah, that was really interesting. This is let me see how to ask this question. I was struck by the fact that well, it's not surprising at all, but that there's an association between beautiful musical passages and the major key, something in B major, right? And I was just wondering if when you did the experiment, if you looked at what came before the musical work that goes into producing those beautiful musical passages. I say this because there's nothing in a major chord, just the playing of a major chord, that's beautiful. In a musical work, there's a lot that has to be done for one to even hear that major chord as doing something interesting. You might linger on a minor chord and you get something very sad, and then you move to a tense dominant chord, and then you get that all important thing, a resolution. But if you think about it in these terms, there's a lot going outside of one's experience of the musical passage that's setting the stage for the experience of it as beautiful. And a related question, because Elizabeth mentioned jazz, and everyone hates jazz, and that frustrates me. In jazz, they substitute every chord for a dominant chord, which people tend not to find very beautiful. And it might encourage the thought that there has to be some exposure to a genre or to a musical form for one to be able to experience in the right way. So I would take it that what people who like jazz learn to listen and perhaps find beautiful are the ways in which the dominant chord works there. And being comfortable sitting with tense musical passages and finding those interesting.
I think
that was really interesting. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, John. So yeah, I mean, I glossed over how we concluded things like, this particular type of passage, beautiful passage, was more major, more clearly major, key clarity, and so on. The way we were able to say that is we actually took the moments preceding, I know 10 seconds before the passage isn't the same as the whole musical context, but it gave us an indication of at least locally what was happening. So yeah, we would extract the features from the passage itself and the moments before, and that's why I said low tempo, low tension, low energy, not arousing at all, beautiful passage. There was nothing changing really. The others, there'd be changes in tonality, changes in dynamics, changes in pitch, and so on, but that wasn't. And so I think, I agreed. I think that comes up nicely in the second study where people talk about the contrast, and the example we gave was them talking about how it went from gentle to sort of a climax, but we saw so many examples. At some point, I took this study and used it as an example or use it to motivate a whole research agenda and looking at novelty or change. But yeah, I definitely think it's what happens, before leading up to that moment. And I think that's relatedly, what I said, I tend to look at musical expectancy in most of my research, started in my PhD, and have used a model of statistical learning that sort of allows you to learn from a corpus of musical styles and the melody, piece of music as it unfolds. And the assumption there is that our expectations, and Leonard Meyer would say, therefore, the emotion and meaning we derive from music is related to what we're expecting. And that model has been used to explore different types of listeners, jazz versus classical, and different cultural musical styles and so on. So again, yes, I think we like to think we did a study. I think Guy mentioned it, where we've compared atonal music experts to more Western art tonal music experts, and shown differences in where they attend and how they engage, purely from just all that exposure and training and interest they already have. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Terrific. I have, just for the record, to take issue with John's assertion that there's nothing intrinsically beautiful about a major chord, but I'll just let that stand. Rebecca.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That was super interesting. I wanted to ask you about some things that came up towards the end of the talk, about the consistency and the attributions of beauty. I was really fascinated by the fact that it seemed that people who describe themselves as kind of lacking expertise or familiarity with music were more consistent in their attributions of beauty than people with more experience. And I wondered if that was the right. And if so, yeah, like what are your thoughts on as to why that might have occurred?
Yeah, it's a tricky finding actually. It's not tricky so much as there's different ways of looking at it. And it was only like 2 days ago I told Yuko, look, we can't ignore the fact that non-musicians were similarly consistent for loudness and beauty, because we've been emphasizing, we do the analysis we do shows that beauty is less consistent. And we're like, interesting, beauty has perceptual stuff going on, emotional stuff, judgment, there's context. We can see why people might be less consistent than just rating loudness. So we were happy with that finding. We thought it was interesting that musical expertise seemed to be driving loudness judgments. We thought the keener, better at listening. And so there was that, but they're not consistent, it doesn't drive beauty consistency. We thought that's interesting. But I guess just to clarify that actually it wasn't that musical experts were more consistent than non-experts. It was kind of a straight line. It was that musical experts were relatively less consistent than themselves. So they were getting better. Sorry, they were good at rating loudness, but they were less good at rating beauty. And so and that's why we had, I'm actually really glad that we used loudness in addition to beauty, because I was a bit nervous when we started designing the study. I was like, if we just see a flat line, we won't know what was going on. So throwing in loudness meant that we could show that musicians were better at something. They were better at rating this perceptual quality and being consistent with themselves, but they weren't better than non-musicians as rating the, agreeing with themselves about where they find music beautiful. And I think a flat line, showing that musicians are no different to non-musicians doesn't mean that everything is similar under the hood. It could be that non-musicians are just not very good, as you saw with the sort of loudness ratings. But what happens that's non-musicians, but what happens with musicians is that they're good at sort of saying, yep, that's great, but then they change their mind as well because they, et cetera. So there might be two forces at play where they're quite good at identifying moments, but then they decide, actually, on this listen, I don't care about that moment. I want to think about this other bit. And then they end up looking similar to non-musicians. I thought what was interesting was, beginning to dissect how you could be musically sophisticated and showing that there were some things that at least predicted consistency, and maybe that sort of, maybe that tendency to think I can tell two things apart and I know when someone's off tune. It just speaks to slightly more, maybe better listening skills, but also maybe more attention to detail that is then translated to consistency in making judgments. All of these studies, I always feel like they're a little bit artificial, aren't they? So who knows? Maybe they're just very good at, doing the homework, and they're like, okay, you want me to tell you where it's beautiful? Fine, it's here. And then, and then they're better at it the second time if they have certain skills.
I see. Yeah, okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I hope that helps. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks.
Yeah.
Perfect. We'll move on to Jacopo.
Well, thank you, Diana. That was fascinating. I will have to leave in a minute, but I just want to ask one of the many questions that I have, which is, so as you mentioned, you have worked a lot on expectancy and prediction, and I'm working on that as well from this predictive processing perspective. But there are many aspects of enjoying music and the impacts that music has that doesn't seem to have a lot to do with this sort of more cognitive part of our engagement with music, and even not to do with the music itself. So when you mentioned the factors that have impacted people most in the second study, you mentioned emotional support, reminiscence, and identity. So I was wondering whether there are sort of ways of sort of bridging the two things, the sort of expectation part of your story and the being moved part of your story, and whether one could see also these impacts of emotional support and reminiscence as sort of inferential in a way, as providing as music providing us some sort of scaffold, cognitive scaffold, and emotional scaffold. Yeah.
So yeah, I think sometimes I focus a lot on one thing, and yeah, in the last years it felt like it was too much on the information dynamics of music, and so and then I'd realize, no, there's things like timbre, and we're just completely ignoring the fact that, the violin may have a different impact, effect to piano, just the attack time, everything can contribute to emotion. And we know that in the emotion research, but yeah, it definitely is relevant to something like beauty. So people were talking about the raspiness and the roughness of the melodies, or no, the timbre, the voice in non-beautiful music, and how it was rich and so on. So I think even on the melody, harmony, and so on, even just the sounds, the major chord can be beautiful and so on. I think there's so much going on even before you have a sequence. With regard to other things that people might be feeling, I think lots of emotion can come out, more complex emotions can come out of musical expectancy. I think that's why I'm kind of fascinated by awe and how it might explain it with regard to musical expectancy, because, and the fact and I think all of these contribute. It's why we had so many codes, so to speak, and different pieces will afford people the opportunity to recognize those things as potentially contributing to the beauty experience. Yeah, I think stuff like reminiscence, actually, that finding, sorry, again, just throwing lots of things at people. What I thought was interesting was, yes, people will talk about how it reminded them of things, but less so than for non-beautiful music. We found that there's beautiful music, and you use it when you're trying to make sense of grief. But there's music you listen to often, and that was more likely to be how you built your musical identity. It makes sense. I don't call the music I listen to in my teens that's who I think I am, but it's not my beautiful music. So I think, if anything, things like being moved, again, I think that's a sort of peak emotional response. And I think, again, people say that it's beautiful. Some people said it's beautiful because it does that to me. And I think that can come out of the musical structure, to be honest. But I totally take your point that, if people are finding this beautiful just because it reminds them of a different time, we make that very clear distinction in music and emotion research, where we say that's an episodic memory. It's just reminding you of a good time or a sad time or whatever, but it's not an intrinsic aspect of the musical feature. And I think what we tried to code were really those musical features, and it was reference to melody, harmony, timbre. It was a reference to the what I call cognitive aspects, like complexity and repetition, or structural aspects. And then it was people talking about the aspects of performance, expressivity, which I think are important parts of the music, again, that you might not think about, or you could talk about them in terms of musical expectation. Certainly, if performance may be more interesting because it's not just giving you the same version that you've heard a million times. And but I think there's lots of different ways in which people can identify a piece of music as beautiful. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. It's great to hear that Leonard Meyer's kind of pioneering work on musical expectation that is still so relevant. I think it was brilliant.
Seminal text.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Niels.
Thanks so much. So one is a quick question, and then the real question. The quick question is, how was loudness being understood? Was it literal loudness, or because obviously with compression and normalization and stuff, two things can be equally loud in terms of decibel level, but one can be much louder in some.
Yeah. I think we were just asking them to attend. So two things. I think there was when we asked them to rate how loud the sound was, and it was them. They decided that they could take the definition that they pleased. It's perceptual. And then when we computed loudness to see, how these, or changes in loudness to see how this might differentiate our beautiful passages, it was root mean squared, etc. It was a very objective. I've lost you.
Right.
Yeah, objective feature. So that wasn't perceptual.
And then
the relevant thing is just that there was a change, so we could call it
okay.
dynamic change in the music. Yeah.
And then the thing I was, I guess, more interested in is I thought it was interesting that the sort of amateur musicians were more loquacious than the pros.
Yeah.
And then I just wanted to hear whether there'd been thoughts or hypotheses about why that is. Was it sort of Dunning-Kruger, you know a little bit, so you think you know a lot, or was it that professional musicians skew towards those who were reluctantly forced to train for hours a day but actually had no interest in music, or like what was the...
Yeah. I think, yeah, so it was two groups of people. It was amateur musicians and people high in openness to experience who are basically this is a personality trait that predicts really well whether you go to museums, whether you like sort of more complex music and so on and so forth. You're just open to experience. And it's possible. I think we tried to see if these were, I should know this, if these were independent. I think they were. It wasn't the case that all the amateur musicians were more open. These were two independent sort of effects. I think, yeah, I found it kind of very interesting. I wondered whether it was amateur. You could argue maybe one thing is professional musicians decide, or yeah, what they want to call beautiful, and they might not speak as much about one or the other aspect. I think the findings suggested that amateur musicians were weirdly the ones that were talking about performance and expressivity and all of that more than professionals. And I don't know why. I have to go and dig a bit more into that. I don't know. I think it could be this, they're just a bit more enthusiastic. They're kind of, starting off in their journey, or it's a hobby and they just want to talk about it. And have lots to say, and they have lots of pieces that they enjoy and they want to talk about the different aspects. But it's a very good question, perhaps the most hard to explain finding of the ones I've shown. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Great. And then we have Edgar.
Thanks a lot for this very interesting presentation. I just have a question on empathy and the way you thought it would be interesting to bring it in your research.
Yeah, it's a very good point. So I don't know. I think I was, postdoc. I was interested in everything, and I was like, can I just slip this in? And I think it was because I maybe had been learning about the role of feeling into Einfühlung, the aesthetic response. I don't know if this rings a bell. And I don't remember which texts I was reading. Yes, there were in the psychology literature, people had begun to show that being moved by music can be predicted by levels of trait empathy you have, the extent to which you feel with things. You see a sad movie and then just like in sobs, sobbing away and so on. So it definitely felt like both a trait and a mechanism of interest to, aesthetic responding to music. And that's why I call them sort of engagement variables. There's the sort of interest maybe captures the sort of more cognitive style, or something interesting is happening, let me attend, or, maybe this contributes to a beauty experience. And then there was this more emotional contagion aspect that I was trying to see. And it turned out that didn't differ across any of the beautiful passages. It's probably just a poorly fitted item, probably not, but interested. So interest, was related to the arousingness, potentially the information content of these moments. But yeah, I think it was related to my then interest in the idea of the aesthetic response being related to you feeling with an artwork, Einfühlung, and the psychological literature that was suggesting it predicts feelings of being moved. I hope that answers your question. I was just interested at the time.
Just interested in the time. Well, there was so much to be interested in there. We have about 1 minute left, so I'm going to squeeze in a very quick question, which is, I was quite surprised by the disparity between the kind of pieces of music that people in studies 2 and I think also 3 identified with being beautiful, and those which they identified as playing a role in their sense of like aesthetic identity.
Yeah.
Just like I found that really.
I like that finding too.
Yeah.
Because it reminds me of this idea that music it's subjective, but it's universal. Beauty is subjective but beautiful, but subjective but universal, Kant, and the idea that, and I wonder whether you don't see it as forming your musical identity because everyone else will agree that it's beautiful. What you need to form your identity is, I like alternative, or I like electropop, and certainly in your teenage years, you're forming your identity based on your music preferences, finding your people. and that's possibly the music you listen to often. You put it on, and that's, you know, reminds you, it's had that impact of forming your identity. But beautiful music is different. It's what you turn on when you need, you know, consolation or affirmation, or I don't know, to feel, yeah, experience of beauty, really.
Yeah.
And the assumption is, you assume maybe that everyone would agree that this is a beautiful piece of music, and you don't have to distinguish yourself with it.
There we are, an empirical demonstration of Kant's.
I wasn't going to put that on the slide, but yeah.
Terrific. Well, it remains for us to thank once again Diana Omigie for this really interesting presentation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for the questions, and again, the invitation.
Wonderful. And then I hope you and everyone else will join us again in 3 weeks. So we've got 3 more seminars coming up for the rest of the semester. Francie Russell from Bernard is coming on the 16th of April. And we have Pablo Tino from Montclair University on the 21st of May. And then we'll be doing something from Uppsala on the 4th of June about the project. So thanks very much for joining us today. Thank you again, Diana. It's been terrific, and goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Zaki, how are you doing? Oh.